Um, as this audience will know well, crisis was actually. I want to start here though with these are some quotations from the archive. This is the first thing we did when we started sort of writing this bit about crisis was to go search the archive. And so I'll give you a second to read a few of these diary excerpts that use the term crisis. There's one more. As you may have inferred, this last one is about the pandemic. So these quotations from the archive, I think, actually foreground like what's kind of the productive problem of the word crisis, which is that it covers just an extraordinary array of problems, right? A crisis in the archive can be as small as a minor personnel problem in an academic department and a global pandemic, and the same term covers both of them. And I think this is a productive problem because our project is increasingly seeming to us to be about the way a sense of crisis informs everyday life. And of course, that was also on the minds of the mass observers. Here you have the definition of crisis from the Oxford English Dictionary, which actually I think this is clearly the definition that people have in mind in the archive, right? A situation of intense difficulty, insecurity, or danger, either in the public sphere or in one's personal life. So the term crisis, just in its basic definition, kind of contains or reaches out to both the everyday and sort of large public, widely observed historical upset, right, at the same time. Um, Obviously, a sense of crisis was in the minds of the mass observers at the very start. And I want to sort of go to this, just the first quote here. This you'll recognize this from the 1939 book Britain by that was written by Charles Madge and Tom Harrison. I'll give you just a quick second to read that quote. So there's that phrase continuous crisis, which actually almost sounds kind of like an oxymoron, right? I mean, if it's continuous, can it be a crisis? And in a sense, that's the problem that I'm talking through here with reference to these earlier and now and later some contemporary writers. Um, Madge and Harrison, as you probably will remember, also in this book acknowledge the problems of crisis as a term. Um, they were writing about, part of what they were writing about in that book was what they perceived as a crisis of mass communication, where, what they called a gulf existed between ordinary people and the kind of representative institutions that are supposed to represent them, including, the political class, but also the national press. There was a sense that there's a blocked flow of information going in both ways there, both from so like ordinary people are not getting good information about what's happening in Whitehall or about what scientists are doing, which is very important to the mass observers at that point. But also, people in Whitehall and people in Fleet Street are not getting a good sense, are not getting any flow of information from the people. And so the mass press are putting out facile generalizations about what quote unquote England is thinking, right? Um, and so, they use the term intellectual serfdom to describe this gulf of information flow between the, sort of centers of power and ordinary people. Um, the quote about continuous crisis sort of suggests here that the continuous crisis really is modernity writ large, and that but ordinary people are not aware of the forces of modernity that are driving crisis. But what ordinary people experience instead is these eruptions in the press of what appear to be acute crises, such as the Munich crisis or the abdication crisis. Madge and Harrison wrote that these news crises, quote, come suddenly out of the blue and rapidly disappear again. That's, or it seems that way to ordinary people, right? Um, as you can see from the quote from the Linns, they also, although they don't use the term exactly the same way, they also have this sense of modernity as an unfolding and continuous crisis. And you can sort of see this is from the opening pages of the Middletown book. So then when we started working on the Middletown project and really wanted to kind of marry these two, marry methods and traditions of these two early 20th century projects in a new kind of project, we also sort of entered with a sense of crisis in multiple ways. First of all, as Jim said at the start, we're doing this work in a Rust Belt town where corporate abandonment is a major factor in the economic and kind of social setup of this community. And that, in a way, that functions as a kind of continuing crisis of modernity, right? Just a kind of later stage of the sort of continuous crisis that mass observation and Middletown are writing about. At the same time, we also, very much like the mass observers, are entering in what we perceived as a moment of media crisis. Although in a sense, it's really kind of an inverse of what the mass observers saw. If the mass observers were seeing what they saw as a situation in which the ordinary person has no way of expressing himself to representative institutions, we had almost the opposite situation, right? Where, we're in the age of social media, where, there are outlets for ordinary people to express their opinions. But in 2016, like the Gamergate scandal had just happened. The phenomena of doxing was a relatively new term in circulation. And so we have like a kind of hyperactive media where people have a platform in which ordinary people have a platform in which to express their opinions. But in that moment in 2016, it appeared as though the sort of media landscape had sort of sorted itself into siloed and hostile communities, sort of mutually hostile communities. And so, really, the kind of almost utopian ideas around everyday life in Middletown, which the students in the original class really contributed to, was this sense that the everyday life in Middletown archive would become a digital commons, a kind of a place where people would write about the everyday and reflect on the everyday and on each other's kind of takes on the everyday. And the archive would, we hoped would kind of become a place where people documented shared experiences. Um, and, we saw it as kind of, and I'm actually quoting from an article we published in 2019, where we said we hoped the archive would become, quote, a modest antidote to the fevered technology-fueled polarization of the present day.